The Witch Tape, a scary short story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Like most bad ideas, the whole thing had actually started as a joke. A flippant remark that should really have been swatted away like a persistent fly, or left to dissolve into memory like an indistinct blur of the day's other conversations. It should have been, but it wasn't. Instead, the joke became an idea that grew into a suggestion, and before I knew it, was gathering mass like a snowball rolling downhill, picking up both speed and size the further it was pushed. Within minutes, the joke had grown and mutated into a full-blown plan of action, for which arrangements were already being made. Once the ball gets rolling like that, it's always hard to stop. Bad ideas have a momentum of their own. Moorfield was a quiet town, filled, unfortunately, with not-so-quiet people. The primary forms of entertainment in this tiny rural backwater being either to gossip about other people's intrigues and indiscretions, or actively participate in them yourself for the future discussion of others. As a trio, Adrian, Dion, and I had long ago decided to opt out of both. The day of the joke, we had been walking, as we often did, in the hills that surrounded the town, beers clinking in our rucksacks alongside a hastily thrown-together meal that mainly consisted of bread and crisps. We began the walk with the usual shared sense of having made some kind of escape from town, and the intention of gaining most of our daily calories in liquid form. We made these rambles away from the stultifying boredom of the small town centre and the judgmental glances of the curtain-twitching locals almost every week, and even when the weather was bitingly cold. On those occasions, we would bundle up, find some patch of open moorland to build a fire, set up camp, and merrily drink the cold away, preferring our beer jackets and actual frost to the frosty reception our daytime drinking would have received in town. As usual, we had spent most of the day in the hills overlooking the town, and as adolescent boys tend to do, had exchanged humorously barbed reports of what each of us had done to the other's mother whilst feeling the warm glow and mildly effervescent fizz of the alcohol beginning to work its magic. Later, we began, as we always did, to head down toward the woods that fringed the town, just as the sun was setting. Our wilderness drinking sojourns were primarily a daytime activity, acting as they did as the precursory warm-up to an evening in one of the two pubs in town we would actually get into without being asked for proof of age. On a normal day, we tended to be back before sundown, changing into more suitable pub attire at Adrian's by the time it went dark. We did sometimes stay out, camping in the summer in Dion's brother's battered tent, but never, under any circumstances, did we camp in or near the woods. For though we never discussed it, somehow we all knew instinctively never to be around there at night. Until I made the joke, and that instinct was suppressed and overridden by an immature desire to not appear chicken in front of your friends. In fact, it was at the edge of the woods that I first made the joke that I would come to regret, and where I first saw the filmy brown tangles of unfurried tape hanging in knots from the trees. Looking back now, I remember there being tons of the stuff, marking the entrance to the woods like curtains or bleak decorations for some forgotten pagan festival. But in reality, that first time, I think there was very little, perhaps only a few strands, hung across the path like a barrier, blocking with the flimsiest of barricades the path into the woods that I, more even than the other two, hated with a passion. I had always hated them. I hated the fact that my route home from the train involved walking through them, down the narrow dirt path, always, it seemed, at dusk. I hated the way that in the cloistered huddle of the streets, the fading light would play tricks on the eyes and show, just at the edge of vision, the tiniest flickers of movement beside you. A movement that always ceased whenever you turned to check, presenting instead only the lightest breeze through the leaves and an empty, almost mocking stillness that, moments earlier, you'd have sworn had not been there. I hated that lonely walk. Watching as the sun began to sink behind the trees, I would hear my own footsteps, the gentle, empty clack of my heel upon the stone path, and listen every time for those other, more subtle sounds. The sounds that hang in the near silence, the sounds of noise, not absent, but withheld. Suppressed and smothered by things that wish to go undetected, the stealthy, near silence of predators. I knew it was ridiculous. This was England. Unlike other parts of the world where wolves and bears are a real concern, the largest predator in our woods was a fox or badger, both of which were nocturnal and hardly a threat to humans. I was hardly likely to be gnawed to death by a squirrel. To fear running the predators in Britain's woods was stupid. To fear running into something else, something perhaps not altogether natural, was not only stupider still, but either juvenile or insane. Yet, in the whispering stillness of the near dark, the primal part of my brain still took charge and filled the shadows around me with teeth and claws, sketching in broad, dark strokes the things that watched and lurked there. The things that didn't care if you believed or not, and which, given the chance, would turn you into prey. I would walk that path every night, hating to admit to myself that the dark, rushing in and rising around me like the tide, made me feel on edge. That even in my mid-teens, hurtling at speed toward adulthood and supposedly toward maturity, I still felt the fear churning in my belly when left alone in that wood. Still felt the cold electric crackle of hair standing on end every time a branch would snap or a bush rustle when it shouldn't. I suppose it is the curse that comes with imagination. The price you pay for the gift of creativity is that you can't switch it off, and sometimes in place of inspiration, the mind conjures dark things instead. Many was the time that my imagination followed me through those woods like a shadow, clinging and looming in the space just behind me. Sometimes it would inhabit the branches of the trees, making them reach out like thin, brittle fingers, stretching forward to grasp and snare my coat with sharp, taloned nails. They never quite got there. They were only in my mind. Yet, I always felt them trying, and knew how close they'd come. Some days, when the train was late and the sun further toward the horizon, which unfortunately in England is common occurrence, I ran. Sprinting down the hill, though I knew a fall would mean injury, I threw myself perilously forward, feet pounding the gravel, in desperation to be out by dark, rushing against the fading of the light, legs kicking and freewheeling beneath me, so that the trees on either side became a blur, and I would emerge, panting and choked onto the road and the safety of streetlights, as night began to fall. Looking back at the path, watching as the woods, smirking at my panic, seemed to close around it, I swore that I'd never go in there at night, and I never did, until I made the joke, and Adrian took me seriously. At the edge of the wood that day, I noticed the tape. It was the tape from inside of an audio cassette. I had seen the same thing on other days, of course, strings of brown celluloid hanging over the wooden gates separating the fields we had to traipse through, or strung haphazardly over the stiles. I had seen it many times, but only this once had decided to comment on it. "Why do people do this?" I asked absent-mindedly, lifting the thin brown film with one finger. "You see it all over. On the sides, on the barbed wire. There's more of this crap caught on the fences than there is sheep's wool. I mean, why bring a tape all the way out here just to wreck the damn thing and leave it everywhere?" Dion shrugged, but as he turned and caught sight of what I was talking about and saw me twirling the tape in my fingers, he cried out, slapping the spool of tape from my hands with a well-aimed blow. "Don't touch that!" he shouted like a primary school teacher scolding a child. I stepped back and regarded him suspiciously, wondering if this was to be another one of his stupid games. The expression on his face, however, convinced me that it wasn't. Whatever had gotten into him, it wasn't good. You don't touch that stuff. It's just bad, okay?" he said before turning and uncharacteristically beginning to walk away. Adrian and I glanced at each other for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Jesus, Dee, I didn't realise you were such a music critic. You must have some bleeding good ears on you if you can tell it's crap even when it's all chewed up like that." Adrian cupped his hand around his ear to gesture that he was listening, as if there actually were, impossibly, a tune playing from the unstrung tape that had met with Dion's disapproval. He shook his head. "I don't hear anything. Oh, wait, something's coming through. Dion, you're right, this is bad. Terrible, in fact. But I thought you liked boy bands." "That's not what I mean," said Dion, sulkily stating the obvious. It's witch tape," he concluded finally. He said it as if the phrase was meant to have great gravitas or mean something to us. In a way it did, but that something was hilarity. "Oh, this is great," I said mockingly, not forgetting but certainly not revealing, as I did, the times that I had sprinted through the woods with the half-heard rumours about witches and black magic in the area close at my heels. "And what, pray tell, is witch tape?" I chortled. "Please don't tell me your mum was recording what we got up to. That would break my heart," Adrian chipped in, never missing an opportunity to call Dion's mother's reputation and chastity into question. Dion glared at him and, ignoring Adrian's comment, decided instead to answer my question. "You can laugh all you want," he began. "Oh, I will, heartily," I replied, but he went on. "You can laugh, but you both know there are some weird people around here that do all that devil-worshipping stuff." Adrian and I, again, shared a glance, though, if pressed, we would both admit to having heard such stories, at least in passing. My brother's mates seen them doing it on Halloween, all running about on the croft, buck naked and dancing and stuff. It's fucking creepy. "I don't know," I added with a wry smirk. "The naked dancing bit sounds like fun. Usually Adrian has to pay for that kind of stuff. Must get a bit nippy in winter, though." Adrian smiled, but Dion, whose voice had taken on a profoundly serious tone, continued. "I'm not laughing. It's true, they do it every year. My brother told me about it." Here, though I mocked, I had to give some leeway. Dion was not alone in having heard such stories. Many was the time I had sat in the school cloakroom on a rainy afternoon and listened to stories about covens and witches in the woods or on the croft. Some said they were killing children or sacrificing chickens, all of them swearing solemn oaths that a friend of a friend had seen witches dancing around a fire or worshipping a goat. Others said that the participants took drugs and engaged in wild orgies, a word that at the time I didn't know the meaning of beyond knowing it was something vaguely sexual. I had heard also about the strange runic markings supposedly carved into the trees in Fuller's Wood, and how if you looked at them for too long, you would wake the next morning to find the same strange letters burnt onto your skin. I had never been in danger of this on account of how I tended to sprint past the trees, any markings not being in my field of vision long enough to be noticed, let alone do any cursing. I had heard too that some of the old folks still insisted on referring to Fuller's Wood by its old local name of Whistling Woods, and that on some old maps it was even labelled that way, on account of the strange echoing sighs and moans that were said to come from the trees after dark. Again, I never spent long enough in the woods to test the story's validity. "All right," I conceded. I'll admit there are some weirdos about, but that doesn't have to do with this stuff." As I said this, I moved my hand as if to touch the tape, but before Dion could object, I had already decided against it. "You're not going to tell me they record all their hocus-pocus bullshit?" Dion looked at me solemnly and nodded. "You mean like black mass and spells and stuff?" Adrian butted in with obvious disbelief in his voice. Again, in silence, Dion simply nodded. "But wait," I half laughed. "If they record it all, then why would they just wreck the tapes and leave it all over the fucking countryside? I swear, mate, every time you open your mouth you make less sense." "It's witchcraft, like a charm or a curse," said Dion, not a hint of humour colouring his response. "Once the spell's recorded, they break the plastic, unspool the tape and spread it all over so that it's all across that land. Then it's like they own the place. Sometimes it's a curse, sometimes it's for magic, like conjuring spirits and stuff, but listen, it's just bad." With that, he turned and again began to walk away, proceeding into the woods as if the conversation were over, when in fact it was far from it. It was at this point that I, stupidly, made the joke. "Well, guys and ghouls, it's Halloween next week. If they're all going to be out here dancing about in the chud, then we should come back and see if we can see them. I wouldn't mind seeing a bit of witch's nipple." I laughed at my own remark. Dion was not amused, so I glanced around for support from Adrian, who had also raised a smile. As I caught sight of his grin, however, I realized instantly that the joke had been a mistake, for alongside the smile, there was a dangerous, mischievous glint in Adrian's eye. The joke had been taken seriously, and suddenly stopped being funny. Over the course of the next few days, the tape was all Adrian would talk about. He'd been to the library and started reading up on local folklore, the witch trials, and even what he called maleficium. He turned up to school with sheets of badly photocopied pages painted with slashes from his highlighter pen and printouts of microfilm records, newspaper reports relating to witchcraft in the area, and anything dubious relating to Fuller's Wood, reports that were admittedly disconcertingly numerous. "Turns out Professor Van Helsing over here was right," he announced one lunchtime, waving at Dion over yet another spread of news clippings and notes. "The whole tape thing is a proper urban legend. There was a small-scale Satanism hysteria in the mid to late 70s where the media in Britain suddenly got obsessed with the idea of devil worship and people performing black masses and sacrifice and whatnot. Obviously, most of it was bullshit, but the superstition about the tape being littered across the countryside was a genuine belief. People said that they were recordings of spells or rituals." Dion nodded solemnly, oddly proud that his meagre knowledge of local fables had been confirmed. "That's not all, though. If you look at the news reports from around here going back a few years," he pointed a bony finger to a collection of clippings taken from the Gazette and another, now defunct, local newspaper. "Some people totally believed it. The police have been involved in everything, breaking up bands of people dancing naked near Bluebell Croft in Fuller's Wood." He again tapped the finger onto reports, the headlines of which screamed about witches' Sabbath and 4 arrested at naked ceremony. "You know what that means, don't you?" Adrian went on excitedly. Dion and I glared at each other and shook our heads, though of course we had our suspicions. Adrian, in response, threw his hands in the air as if unveiling the conclusion of some great magic trick. "It means spooky sluts and kinky witches. Crazy housewives dancing around with their diabolical dangly bits showing," he cried in a tempestuous swirl of adolescent hormones loud enough to make a few other students turn to look. "Here's the plan. We take Dion's brother's tent, we camp out in Fuller's Wood, and around midnight we creep up to Bluebell Croft with our binoculars and take a peek. It'll be awesome." At the mere mention of the woods, I felt the skin on my scalp tighten as the hair bristled to attention. "Are you mental?" was my pithy response as I tried to laugh the suggestion off as another of Adrian's pipe dreams. To my alarm, however, Dion, who had seemed to be the most honestly fearful of the three of us, was grinning broadly, the promise of seeing a real-life boob overriding any fears of the supernatural he may have held. "I'll tell my folks I'm crashing at yours, and you tell your parents you're at mine. My brother has some army-grade binoculars. Might even be able to nick his camera if he's out." "Oh yeah," I replied sarcastically, "and then you'll just wander into Boots and get your pervy pics of some witch's bare ass developed, will you? You'd be arrested, you moron." "Actually," said Dion, elongating the word with exaggerated importance, "my brother uses the darkroom at his uni, so if I promised him a copy, I reckon he'd develop them for us." "Awesome," Adrian repeated supportively. The grin had not left his face for the last 10 minutes. "Saturday night it is, then." "You guys are serious, aren't you?" I asked, desperate for one or the other to say they were joking, to side with me and steer this conversation off its blatantly dangerous path. Instead, they both nodded, and so, 2 days later, I found myself lying to my parents, meeting with Adrian and Dion, and traipsing reluctantly for the first time in my life into Fuller's Wood after sundown. Going into the woods that night, I remained deeply conflicted. Whilst, like any teenage boy, I did not want to appear a coward in front of my friends, the apprehension and fear with which I approached the prospect of entering the woods was obvious, my nerves fighting tooth and nail against my idiot desire to be cool. Several times I tried to persuade the others not to go, presenting barriers and potential problems, some with merit, others invented. Reasons upon reasons why we shouldn't go. I warned about the cold. It was, after all, October in England and bitterly cold. We could catch hypothermia, I insisted, unsure as to whether it was, in fact, something you caught. Or, I insisted, we could get frostbite and lose our toes like those Arctic explorers. These concerns were laughed off with the promise of fire, all-weather sleeping bags, and promises that Dion would snuggle up to me and keep me warm if I got cold. Roundly dismissed, I tried another line of attack. The police, I said, had patrolled the area every Halloween and, as we knew, in previous years had made arrests. How did they think the police would react to 3 teenage boys camping out with binoculars? We didn't want to get in trouble, did we? This worry too was brushed aside, given only a cursory comment even as we advanced toward the tree line. Finally, in desperation, I went for the jugular, exposing the naked nerve, the root of my reservations. "What if it's all true?" I pleaded. The others only laughed and said they hoped it was. Naked was naked, spooky or not. So, defeated and reluctant, I allowed myself, despite my fears, despite the ice in my belly and the tingling sensation running up my spine, to be cajoled, bullied and pressured into those woods. It would be the last time I'd ever enter them. I have to admit that for the first few hours the experience was not that bad. Alongside the camera and binoculars, the reliably light-fingered Dion had also managed to acquire a few beers from under his brother's bed, whilst Adrian had brought a plastic water bottle full of whiskey, siphoned from one of his dad's bottles, which he had then topped back up with cold black tea mixture he had prepared the night before. "It's the exact same colour," he reliably informed us whilst swigging the genuine article like a pirate from an empty bottle of Malvern. We spent the first few hours after setting up the tent, drinking, telling dirty jokes, and risking salmonella by eating half-raw sausages that were burnt on the outside and worryingly pink within. All the while getting regular time checks from Adrian as he counted down to midnight like he was preparing for a rocket launch. "T-minus 3 hours to titties," he'd announce, never once clarifying how he was privy to the witch's schedule or how he became so certain that they would all be naked. Eventually, however, the hour approached, and we rose to make the short journey to the clearing commonly referred to as Bluebell Croft. This croft was actually just an open area close to the centre of the woods where, in spring, the bluebells that gave the area its name would bloom. In October, however, you were more likely to find frost than flowers. As we rose, slinging our rucksacks onto our backs, I have to admit the alcohol and company had gone some way to chasing away my fears. until we heard the sound. Save for our juvenile laughter and bawdy conversations, the wood had remained, up to that point, relatively noiseless. Every now and again there would be a flutter as a bird changed its position in its roost, or a wheezing echo as a breeze caught the few dry leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches. This sound, however, was different. It rang through the silence with the clarity of a bell, slicing through the night in a shrill, high-pitched shriek. All three of us froze. The sound had come from somewhere before us, far beyond the tree line and the few ghostly rows lit by the fire. It had come hurtling and unbeckoned from the dark. An hour earlier, swigging whiskey and laughing in the way you only do as a teen, I had joked that perhaps we wouldn't need to go up to the croft, that perhaps the witches would come looking for us. We had all laughed then. Now, though, standing by the fire where we had set up camp, feeling the dark between the trees slowly creep around us, it felt extremely far from a joke. Behind us, the fire, spurred into life by half a bottle of lighter fluid, cracked and popped, spitting its flickering orange glow up into the air and providing the only source of light save for the glassy white spectres thrown by our torches. This had been a mistake. Coming to the woods had been a mistake, and now I was sure we were going to pay for it. Moving closer together, huddling and closing ranks in a way that seemed to mirror the actions already taken by the trees, we each stared into the darkness, listening, straining to catch and then to flinch at every crack of a branch, every whispered rustle, as things unseen brushed through the leaves. Before us, billowing in clouds of condensation, our own breath hung in the frozen air, swirling and dancing as it drifted through the meagre beams of the torchlight. Another crack. Closer now. Bracken fracturing loudly underfoot as something, moved slowly between the trees. "There's something in there," said Dion, the words half-throttled by fear. Though all I could see was black, I knew instinctively that he was right. "That scream," I whispered, scared to raise my voice and rouse attention. "What the hell was that?" Adrian answered, though he never took his eyes from the trees. "It sounded like an animal," he said, all the boyish mirth drained from his voice. I knew what he meant. Below the initial piercing cry there was undoubtedly something wild and animalistic about the cry, yet I knew deep down, as I think he did too, that the call was no animal. There was something in the timbre, the full-throated roundness of the cry, that sounded less like a howl and more, far more, like a voice. "We need to get out of here," I remember saying, though I could feel even then my legs turning to liquid beneath me. Slowly and almost in unison, we began to step backward, our eyes fixed before us, and we maneuvered slowly around the fire, back towards the path that would lead us out of the woods, back toward the road, the streetlights, and safety. Until, rising and mewling as if strangled out from the throat of night itself, the call came again, and we three ran. We sprinted headlong, leaving behind the tent and the fire, hurtling with reckless, terrified abandon out of the clearing, onto the path, and down towards town, out of the woods and away from whoever, whatever, had made those awful cries. We ran, it seemed to me, faster than I ever would have thought possible, until Adrian stopped and, with tears, cool and glassy pooling in his eyes, pointed weakly ahead. The spools of tape covered the path, strung across in thick knotted strings from the bare, clawing fingers of the trees. In places, it dropped in thick nests of multiple tendrils, whilst other places it stretched thin and taut, almost to the point of snapping, forming a netted, tangled barrier across the path, forming, it seemed. I allowed the word to form on my lips before I confirmed its awful truth. A web! For bound up within the spools of tape, hanging in pendulous droplets like filmy dark fruit, were bulbous, drooping shapes. Spun around like bobbins, the tape twisted over solid forms that twitched and struggled, fighting against their bonds. Small patches of fur and paws protruding at awkward angles as a tiny chorus of baleful howls began to rise and build. Seeing the tiny bodies suspended from the trees like horrific baubles, I remembered the other stories, the headlines I'd only glimpsed, the ones about missing pets. The noise from the animals continued to rise, only to be met and swallowed by another hideous choir. For as the dangling cats and dogs strained against the web and the wind disturbed the tape, voices, speaking their twisted noise, sounds like strange inversions of words, seemed to billow through the trees, as if, by some awkward friction, the voices captured on the tape were pealing forth and rising into the air, and playing. The words and rituals recorded on the now broken tapes spilling and calling from their celluloid tombs until they rose and overlapped, merging into a mess of words, whispers and cries, shouts and murmurs, writhing over one another like serpents in a mating ball. I traced the line of these awful strings, the threads of outspun tape, following their lengths to where they converged and half expecting to see some gigantic spider, plump with its feast, resting at the centre of its acetate web. Instead, what I saw was a knotted twist of tape as thick as a man's arm that writhed and curled slowly down into a hole that had formed in the ground. I watched, my jaw slack with disbelief, as the tape was gently pulled, wound in like a line or net tugged by a fisherman on shore, and disappeared inch by inch into the hole. I stared in silent disbelief as several of the parcelled creatures, still struggling feebly against their bonds that sang in awful chants, were pulled towards that hole to be slowly and deliberately swallowed. The next thing I knew, there was a hand at my throat. Dion, screaming, his cries drowned out by the multitudes ranting their incantations from the tape, clutched at my collar and tore me backwards away from the path. Then, again, we were running. Not along the path, but through the wood itself, branches and roots pulling at our arms, our feet trying with every grasping moment to wrench us back, to fasten upon us and hold us within. That final run was a blur. I didn't, I don't think, even see where I ran. My mind was still fixed on the vision I had seen, not to be swayed, until, panting and trembling in terror, we spilled out onto the road and fell, as a three, to our knees, beneath the streetlight's orange glow. A week later, the Gazette, which had for the previous fortnight carried stories of missing dogs and beloved cats that seemed to have vanished, ran instead with the events of that night, though their account differed greatly from ours, and we three did not feature anywhere in the coverage. Their story did not mention tape. Instead, it told of several arrests, most for indecent exposure. One incident, however, was far more sinister. A woman in her mid-40s was arrested separately from the naked crowd and found to be not only lacking clothes, but streaked from head to toe with animal blood. Initially charged with animal cruelty owing to the carcasses found in the vicinity and later committed to the psychiatric ward, the woman was said to have made a very strange confession. When asked if and indeed why she had stolen and killed these family pets, her response was always the same: a wry, sardonic smile and the phrase, "I fed them to it." We never went back to retrieve the tent, and none of us ever entered those woods again. Leaving the train 2 stops early, I now take a different route home. This has been The Witch Tape, a scary short story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2020 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.